Hello, my friends, and welcome to Origins. My name's Don Chapman. It's my privilege to be your host. Origins is a forum where we take the evidence of science, we use it to validate the truth of creation. We're in the midst of a series of shows talking about the work of the RATE group. And Dr. Larry Vardiman is here, and he is the gentleman who coordinated the work of these eminent Christian creation scientists who pulled together their work to work on the age of the Earth.
Right. The RATE project is radioisotopes in the age of the Earth, and I was kind of the organizer of it and the administrator.
So you pulled together these eight really A-team players from creation science.
That's right.
And you worked for 8 years together. And you came up with 3 incredible conclusions that seem to indicate a young Earth. Would you list those for us?
Sure. We've talked about helium diffusion in a previous program. We've talked about polonium radio halos. And today we're going to talk about carbon-14 and coal and diamonds. And these are just 3 premier examples of accelerated decay and evidence for a young Earth.
I think this term accelerated decay is going to be to the next 10 years what perhaps irreducible complexity was to the last 10 years in this whole debate.
I hope so, even more.
I think that's really exciting. Well, today we're going to talk about carbon-14 dating. Now, I think for most of our folks, people think that carbon-14 is what's used to date everything, but it's not really what's always used in this whole dating scheme, is it?
No, carbon-14 is used for dating organisms that have died or some type of a life process. Carbon-14 has a half-life. That means half of the radioactive material in it has died away within 5,700 years. So only a few lifetimes, it's all gone. Whereas to date rocks, you have to use such things as uranium, lead, or rubidium, strontium, other long-period half-life materials if you're going to date rocks.
So, but carbon-14 then, if we're studying rocks in the age of the Earth, how does that come into play?
Well, carbon-14 relates specifically to fossils and wood and anything that was alive in the past, which we want to get some handle on when it died and how long it's been around on the Earth.
But you're going to apply this to rocks, aren't you? Particularly to coal and diamonds. I'm kind of giving away the story
Right.
here, but
Coal and diamonds are a type of rock, but they have carbon in them.
Yes.
And particularly coal is made up of a material that was compressed, I believe, during the flood. And so we can actually get an estimate of when the flood occurred based upon how old the coal is.
well, we're anxious to see what you have to share with us today, because I think this is a program that has evidence that's almost irrefutable.
One of the first things that we like to talk about is bones. This is a picture from the National Dinosaur Museum in Utah, Vernal, Utah, and we can actually try to date those directly by doing carbon-14 techniques on them. Another thing that we can do is coal, but this hasn't been really addressed very much, at least in the conventional literature, because it's assumed that coal is like 100 million years old. And since carbon-14 has a half-life of about 5,000, almost 6,000 years, if coal is really 100 million years old, you wouldn't expect to find any carbon-14 at all in it.
0, that's right.
0. In fact, the bones that we showed in the previous slide, the dinosaur bones, those are assumed to be 65 million years old or older, so you wouldn't expect to find any carbon-14 in them either. But we're going to talk about that a little bit here because, in fact, we have been finding carbon-14 in these, surprisingly. There is a new instrument that has been developed. It's called an accelerator mass spectrometer. And this was developed about 15 years ago, or a little bit more now. Prior to that, the instrumentation that was used to try to measure carbon-14 in objects, any kind of material, didn't have the precision to be able to find the small amounts of carbon-14 that are still present in coal and dinosaur bones, for example. But about 15 years ago, this instrument was developed, and unbeknownst to us, when we started the RATE project, there was reports already occurring in the conventional literature. So after we started our RATE project, we were informed of this, and we added this effort to our program because it was so significant. And in fact, there was some 70 papers that were present in the literature reporting on carbon-14 in coal. Now, we were completely surprised by this. We didn't know it had been done. And the question is, if there were so many papers in the literature, why hasn't this been widely known and accepted?
So before this machine, we didn't have an instrument precise enough to measure the carbon-14 in coal. Is that right?
That's right. There had been a few creationists who had tried to develop equipment to do that, but it just wasn't precise enough to measure those small quantities.
And the results of this instrument are accepted across the board by all scientists?
Yes, and the reason actually that it's reported so widely in the literature is when they first began to get measurements of carbon-14 in coal, they were scratching their heads and saying this can't be because the coal is too old for there to be any there. Where did it come from? So they assumed it either had to be contamination of the coal, carbon-14 from the atmosphere had gotten into the coal somehow and continued to do so, or their instrumentation, their instrument itself was somehow being contaminated. So they kept reporting on it and refining their instrumentation. A little bit of it was due to that, but they finally eliminated all those possibilities and they were still getting the carbon-14 in the coal.
That's exciting. So you made that a part of your project?
Yes, when we discovered this, we included that as a major part of our project, and the end result of this was a significant evidence for a young Earth, we felt.
Okay.
Okay, well, that was the instrumentation that we had. Let me tell you a little bit about where the carbon-14 comes from in the atmosphere. Cosmic radiation comes in from outer space and strikes nitrogen-14. And it converts it to carbon-14. One of the atoms becomes carbon-14 and it's distributed among all the other gases in the atmosphere. The assumption in carbon-14 dating is that that has been going on ever since the Earth has been here, and at the same rate, so that the amount of carbon-14 is uniform in our atmosphere. That's a major assumption of this process. Now, it turns out I don't believe that that was the case, but it's still the technique that we have to address. There's also this carbon-14 that has been produced by cosmic radiation is then incorporated into living organisms. For example, plants, cows and other animals that eat the plants, other animals like mankind that eats the cows. Embedded in those living organisms is the same balance of carbon-14 and carbon-12 that is present in the atmosphere. When that organism dies, it's no longer incorporating any carbon-14 from the atmosphere, and what's in the organism then decays. And so by measuring the amount of carbon-14 and the carbon-12 in the organism, you can estimate how long it's been dead, how long ago that organism died, whether it's an animal, whether it's a plant, a tree, or a dinosaur, whatever. So you can get an estimate. Now, it's based on the assumption that the carbon-14 and carbon-12 ratio in the atmosphere has always been the same. And as I say, I don't believe that was the case, but that's the technique. Now, how does this apply to trying to estimate, for example, the age of coal and maybe the age of how long ago it's been since the flood? This is an animation showing the carbon-14 and the carbon-12 in the atmosphere being incorporated in a tree, for example. This tree then suddenly being buried by the flood, and all this organic material being buried, grasses and trees and ferns and all that material, into a layer compressed by heavy pressure, forming coal, and then within that coal is that same carbon-12 and carbon-14 that was in the tree to start with, but it was suddenly buried and killed, and then the carbon-14 decays into carbon-12, and you can estimate how long that coal has been around. So if we were to date it using the conventional technique, we would expect, if the flood only happened, say, 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, you would expect to still find some carbon-14.
But if it happened millions of years ago, there wouldn't be any carbon-14.
That's right. If it happened 100 million years ago, which is the standard expectation for a coal layer, it's that old, you wouldn't expect to find any carbon-14 at all. So what happens when you go to the field and collect coal samples and analyze it in this new equipment that has this precise ability to measure carbon-14? It estimates the coal to be about 50,000 years old.
50,000 years old?
50,000, not 100 million years old, but about 50,000 years old.
Okay.
Now, the first thing we had to do was to confirm that this kind of information made sense in the literature. So we went to the literature and got the data, and we plotted it. There was some 70 sets of data that had been reported. We have this all listed in our book that we reported on the RATE project. Here we have the number of samples on the left column. And on the bottom axis, we have the percent of carbon-14 in the sample relative to the modern carbon-14. That's a little bit of a complex measure there. but it comes out that the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12 is what that second C is there, that it comes out to about 0.3. And so that's about the middle of this diagram here, this histogram. And that's much more than we would have anticipated if the coal is old. This is all for coal. But we went further than that. We actually then took samples ourselves, and we didn't have the money to go out and get 70 samples like is reported in the literature, but we wanted just to get a sample. So we went to the Pennsylvania State University coal lab and acquired 10 samples of different kinds of coal, all the way from the top of the formation of the crust of the earth to the bottom. There's different layers, so that you would expect them to be older or younger.
Right.
And this is the kind of samples that we got. Again, we came out with the same diagram, number of samples and the percent of modern carbon, and it came out to about 0.3. Here was about 0.25, somewhere in this neighborhood there. Very close to the larger sample that was reported in the general literature. Now, the significance of this, in addition, was because we had 10 samples of all kinds of coal, it turns out that the distribution is relatively narrow and doesn't show any change as a function of depth. In other words, you would expect there to be much less carbon-14 in coal that was down near the bottom, which was much older, and much more in the coal up near the top, which supposedly would be much younger.
Which assumes uniformitarianism, that gradually, over millions of years, these layers were put down.
Exactly, over
millions of years. And that would mean that the lowest ones would have the least carbon, if any, and the upper ones, if there was any carbon, it would be up there.
But they all had the same amount.
It's the same right through, like it all happened all at once.
All at once. That,
yes.
that gives you an indication that something
right.
dramatic happened very suddenly, all at one time.
Okay.
Okay, well, one of the criticisms for this technique is that possibly the coal has been contaminated. You remember I said all these 70 papers that had been published in the literature said that coal may have been contaminated, or their instrumentation had been contaminated. They eliminated the contamination in their instrumentation, but possibly the coal itself. Now, how that could happen is the coal is under the ground, and you could imagine groundwater percolating from the atmosphere. Okay. It'd have the carbon-14-12 ratio and going down through and percolating through the coal.
So the water could bring fresh carbon.
Potentially could do that. Now, we selected samples, and so did the conventional community, to minimize that, and it's not very likely, but theoretically it could happen. So Dr. John Baumgartner, who conducted this study for us, for the RATE project, had an idea.
My part in the RATE project was to coordinate the research on carbon-14. What we found is like a bombshell as far as evolution is concerned. The essence of our work is that carbon-14 exists in all fossils throughout the geological record at levels easily detected by the current technology. And what this means is that all of these fossils are young. As far as we know, there may have been one or two attempts in the past to look for C14 in diamond, but the standard community, the secular community, would have no motivation. They would think it would be impossible for there to be C14 in diamonds. All of them we have tested thus far are from Africa, but from different parts of Africa, and we have diamonds both from deep mines and also from surface locations where they have been blasted out of the earth, come down, and gotten incorporated into streams and stream beds. So we have diamonds from a deeper earth environment as well as surface environment.
It took them about 2 years to do this experiment. This is kind of an interesting dilemma, because they had to crush the diamonds first, and then they had to take the particles, the fine flour from the diamond particles, and vaporize it in an oven in order to be able to run it through their the accelerator mass spectrometer. Well, the problem was these little bitty chunks of diamond, when they would heat them up to several hundreds of degrees, almost 1,000 degrees centigrade, they would explode. And the first time they did, they blew up their oven. And the guy who was doing this experiment for us under contract was so interested in it, he decided to buy him another oven and try again and break them up finer. Finally, he was able to get the diamonds crushed and vaporized and run the experiment. And guess what he found? He found carbon-14 in diamonds. Estimated that the diamonds were on the order of 50,000 years old as well.
Same as the coal.
Yeah.
Okay.
But diamonds are thought to be 1 billion or more years old. They
Is that
come
right?
from way down in the crust of the earth, and they're thought to be billions of years old, not just 100 million, but 1 billion, 10 times older. And yet they had carbon-14 in them.
Now, the graphs that show them 1 billion years old is not based on any scientific evidence. That's based on assumption, isn't it?
It's based on a whole idea, a model, and so on. And it's applied to it,
Right.
but it's not a direct evidence.
Right.
Yeah, it's a model.
That's right. Well, we have to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to look at this diamond and the carbon in it, and we're going to look at the ramifications that this has to the whole debate of the age of the Earth. Don't you go away. We'll be right back.
Creation versus evolution. You weigh the evidence. Wonderful water, designed for life. Water. We drink it, wash in it, cook with it, and swim in it. Every system in our body uses it. The Earth could not support life without water. Water is 83% of our blood, flushes body wastes, lubricates joints, keeps our body temperature stable, and transports nutrients. Water is a part of cells which make up all living things. It is a very small molecule, but it's the biggest ingredient of our planet. Water has been designed just right by our Creator for life. Today's guest on Origins, Dr. Larry Vardiman, is chairman of the Department of Astrogeophysics at the Institute for Creation Research's Graduate School. Through his ongoing research in atmospheric science, Dr. Vardiman has contributed much to the field of creation science. He also led the RATE team, a research project examining the age of the Earth. This has been documented in the DVD Thousands, Not Billions. For more information, contact the Institute for Creation Research, 1806 Royal Lane, Dallas, Texas, 75229, or call 1-800-337-0375. Or visit the website, www.icr.org.
We're back from the break. We're here with Dr. Larry Vardiman, the coordinator of the RATE group, which did this incredible study. These creation scientists that came together to study the age of the Earth and found 3 incredible discoveries that have really transformed the whole debate about the age of the Earth. And we're talking today about carbon-14. Dr. Vardiman, you just showed us a chart that, according to what you're reading in coal, was about 50,000 years, and then when you got to diamonds, you had the same thing. Now, you have an animation for us about how that worked with the diamonds. We're anxious to see that.
Right, we found a similar result in diamonds, and this was a complete surprise. We weren't expecting it, but it's incredible. Here's an animation of what actually happens here. Diamond is the hardest substance known to man, and inside of it was originally carbon-14 and carbon-12, and then with time, it decays just like it would in coal, and it's not contaminated. It's so hard and so compact a capsule that even water running by it is not going to contaminate it. So whatever was incorporated in there was there to start with, and you couldn't add or remove anything. So if there's carbon-14 in there, you'd expect it to be very young if it's still there. In fact, that's what we found. We found the concentrations of carbon-14 in diamond a little bit less than coal, but it was about the same. It came out to around 30 to 40,000 years old, whereas coal we found to be about 50,000 years old. But the diamonds themselves are conventionally thought to be billions of years old.
So the difference between 30 and 50 is really almost a statistical error at that point. Is that right?
Well, yeah, we think there's some hints there about how they were formed, but we're continuing those studies to try to understand that. But some of our viewers might be confused because I'm saying 30,000 years and 50,000 years. If the flood happened, say, 5,000 years ago, the Genesis flood, how do we get these kind of dates? Well, this comes back to the basic assumption in the carbon-14 technique. You remember at the beginning of the program I said that the basic assumption is that the carbon-14 in the atmosphere has always been the same.
Right.
Well, if the flood really happened, the Genesis flood really happened about 4,000 to 5,000, 6,000 years ago, then there would have been a major change in the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, because the coal and all the material that's buried in the crust of the Earth was organic material that was on the surface of the Earth growing in the atmosphere before the flood.
Okay.
So if you measured the ratio of carbon-14 to carbon-12, it was probably 100 times different. There would probably have been 100 times more carbon-12 in the atmosphere than there is today. So this whole ratio would have been upset by the flood. If you make that adjustment of a factor of something like 10 or so, then you get the 5,000 years instead of the 50,000 years that the conventional estimate comes from. See, the 50,000 years is assuming that the carbon-14-12 ratio is the same now as it was before the flood. But if it wasn't, that can be adjusted dramatically.
Well, where are we going to go with this? What's going to happen in this whole debate about, it seems to me that diamonds are one where, if I were an evolutionist who wanted to prove that diamonds were still billions of years old, I don't know where I'd start.
Well, in fact, that's kind of the response we've gotten from the conventional community. As I've mentioned before, at a conference that we presented these results at, specialists in this area were just astounded by that result, because this is the first time this result had ever been reported in the conventional literature, and it had never been even thought of to do before. In fact, this tells you something about the mindset of a scientist working in the conventional scientific community. They assume everything is old, and they don't even ask the right questions many times.
Right.
So when we got this result, they couldn't explain it, and they were fascinated by it. They encouraged us to continue it, and we understand that there are some people who work in this area that are now doing some of these experiments themselves.
It makes the next few years very exciting for you gentlemen, doesn't it?
Oh, it's wonderful.
There's a whole new debate coming.
Yes.
I do want to share this paragraph. I've read a sentence, but I want to share this paragraph with our folks today. This is the closing paragraph from the introduction to the book that is the conclusion of this 8-year study. And it says this: thus this book opens a new chapter in the origins controversy. As never before, it calls into question the deep time model and places the biblically compatible young earth model on a level of scholarship never before achieved or archived. Its pages contain many profound thoughts which will shake current scientific orthodoxy to its core. It deserves careful consideration by all of those who value truth. I think you're listening to this show because you value truth. And I think when you hear this kind of evidence, that many of you who perhaps started the show with a closed mind are ending the show with an open mind, where you're saying, here's evidence that we have to look at. Here are some things that simply can't be explained away by billions and billions of years. Perhaps you've been duped. Perhaps you've bought in to the idea that if they say it at school, if it's in the textbook, it has to be true. You know, we put our kids in a real dilemma when we teach them that the Bible says that the earth is just a few thousand years old, and then they go off to school, to high school, and then college, and professors with great authority say the earth is billions and billions of years old. You recognize that if we don't address that issue, we're going to lose our young people, didn't you?
Yes, this is one of the top problems that we have in our educational system today, because science and scientists have such credibility when they say the earth is billions of years old. It really puts us in a dilemma when the Bible says it's only 6,000 years or so old.
Dr. Vardiman and these 8 warriors that have worked with him in the laboratory have opened up a whole new arena of debate in the whole issue of origins. Dr. Vardiman, I want to again share with you my heartfelt appreciation for your dedication and your courageous work. And folks, I want to remind you that this is not just opinion. This isn't just superstition. This is digging into the truth of science because we believe the truth of God's Word. And what we find there is absolutely astounding and exciting. And above all, I want you to remember this: it's God's view that He created you. That should be your worldview too. Hope to see you again next time here on Origins. God bless you till then.
Thank you for watching this edition of Origins. If you'd like a copy of the PowerPoint information presented today, you can download a PDF file of program number 815 from our website at www.originstv.org. Or for a DVD of this series, send a $12 donation to cover shipping and handling and write to Origins Program, number 815, Cornerstone Television, Wall, Pennsylvania 15148.
Origins is made possible by the faithful prayers and the financial support of you, our Cornerstone Television family.